Professor Alison Wylie, who came to us in 1985, fresh out of her PhD, and stayed with us until 1998. And those of us who knew Alison during that period know that she had a big impact on Western, not just in the philosophy department, but across the entire university. So it's a real pleasure to have you back again, Alison. She left us to go to Washington University in St. Louis, and from there she went to Barnard, Columbia, and finally landed at the University of Washington, where she is now. So she's come a long way, and we're glad that she's back to see us. She's so busy that it would be absolutely impossible to enumerate the things that she's done, but suffice it to say that right now she's co-editor of Hypatia, the Feminist Journal of Philosophy, and she's also president of the Western Division of the American Philosophical Association. Alison is appointed both in philosophy and in anthropology at the University of Washington, the kind of appointment that she's always wanted. And this allows her to work very closely with people in both fields. In archaeology in particular, there are special problems about evidential reasoning. All across philosophy of science, we worry about how values play into objectivity. But in archaeology, where you're trying to get collaboration among parties, some academic and some not, who bring explicitly partisan views to the table, one has to recognize that to some extent these views are sources of bias, but also rich resources for correction and for better evidential reasoning. And I'm not absolutely sure that that's what Alison is going to talk about today, but it's part of her work that I deeply admire. And it is in fact suggested by her title today, Plurality of Pluralisms, Collaborative Practice in Archaeology. So please join me in welcoming Alison Wylie home again.
Certainly the Rotman Institute's been founded since I was a faculty member here, and I think since I last visited. And it's tremendously exciting to see the way the mission of the Rotman Institute is framed, bringing together all areas of philosophy with interests and concerns and about science. So it's an honor to be back specifically for this lecture. Thanks very much. So just to begin, innovative modes of collaborative practice. Is this okay? Innovative modes of collaborative practice are transforming archaeology, in the process generating examples of methodological and conceptual pluralism that are proving to be powerful catalysts for creative insight. Kathleen got it exactly right. That's what I want to focus on today. What I have in mind are not the interdisciplinary collaborations that have long been stock in trade for archaeologists, working with paleoethnobotanists and geologists and material scientists and a whole range of other disciplinary practitioners, but rather the intellectual as well as the pragmatic partnerships with descendant communities, especially Aboriginal, Indigenous communities, but also a whole range of other descendant communities and stakeholders. While the impetus for these collaborations is almost always, in the first instance, moral and political, they arise from demands for respect, reciprocity, and consultation. Increasingly, they are robustly epistemic. Descendant communities and archaeologists jointly define the research agenda and pursue programs of historical and archaeological inquiry together, sometimes bringing strikingly different conceptual schemes and methodologies to bear on questions of common concern, sometimes bringing their distinctive methodologies to bear on questions they'd never considered. This growing tradition of collaborative practice has provoked some sharply critical science wars-style rebuttals from skeptics who decry the compromises that they believe it entails for properly scientific archaeology. They insist that the kinds of pluralism endorsed by the advocates of these projects, of collaborative projects, cannot but undermine objectivity conceived in terms of impartiality and value neutrality. The fear is that such collaborations open the door to parochial, highly politicized interests and to non- or anti-rational values that are the antithesis to scientific inquiry. Among high-profile reactions of this kind within archaeology The archaeologists in the crowd will know these in gory detail. I think of Jeff Clark. I believe this was a 1996 article that he published in a number of places. The title was Demon Haunted World, in which he characterizes even just requirements of consent and consultation, no robust, cross-fertilizing collaboration, as an assault on reason. And it is quite florid language about how all the gains of the Enlightenment are at the risk of being rolled back by demands of descendant communities. And then more recently, Bob McGee, 2008 article in American Antiquity. He's at the National Museum of Civilization here. Most recently, what he's published is a challenge to the assumption that there are any robust enough collective indigenous identities that could sustain claims, epistemically relevant claims to a distinctive or salient standpoint. His argument is that any identity that in order to make a claim that there is a social or cultural or ethnic identity that's robust enough to sustain epistemic arguments, you have to be reifying, mystifying. Usually these are identities of recent invention. I'll be addressing that argument later in this talk. In both cases, the argument is that it's just a non-starter. There can't be, McGee, there can't be any descendant community insights that are relevant because the identities can't possibly exist. Or in the case of Jeff Clark, Demon Haunted World, if there are and if there is engagement, it can only be compromising of the science. Within philosophy, Paul Boghossian begins his recent book, Fear of Knowledge, 2006, with a discussion of a New York Times news story in which Native American beliefs about tribal origins rooted in oral history are pitted against conclusions drawn from scientific investigation of the archaeological record. The archaeologists in the story, well known to those interested in collaborative practice, Roger Enion and Larry Zimmerman, are described as capitulating to a misguided postmodern relativism. Enion is quoted as saying, "Science is one of many ways of knowing the world. The Zuni worldview is just as valid as the archaeological viewpoint." And Larry Zimmerman is quoted as conceding, quote, "Personally, I do reject science as a privileged way of seeing the world." Boghossian gets lots of mileage out of this, setting up the argument of the book, but he doesn't ever actually return to discuss in any detail these cases. The setup is he argues that these archaeologists are in the grip of what he calls a doctrine of equal validity, from which it follows that there is no basis for comparatively assessing or choosing among alternative worldviews. If we embrace our own worldview, our own approach to inquiry, the only grounds for that must be Rorty's frank ethnocentrism. Now, although Boghossian doesn't consider any further these archaeological cases, I assume they represent the second of three kinds of constructivism that he means to reject. Constructivism about justification. And here's, see if this works. Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this because I'm not interested in developing a rebuttal to Boghossian's argument. This is more a framing. I'm returning the favor. This is a framing from my talk, my agenda, which is to understand what's left out when you engage these issues in historically polarized terms. But just so there's this philosophical anchor, the constructivism about justification he characterizes in terms of a challenge he calls encounter, ENC for short. He asks, would our epistemic norms be called into question if we were to encounter a genuine alternative to them? He sets some constraints on what would count as an alternative. You can see the deck being stacked quite systematically here. Must conform to norms of coherence, I'm quoting here, norms of coherence, which flow directly from the very nature of an epistemic system. And this system must have a track record of success. He allows that we might be inclined to doubt, we might come to doubt our system if a society that we recognize as having, as he puts it, a much more advanced science and technological abilities proved to follow different epistemic norms, different norms of justification. His conclusion: relativists have never presented any examples, constructivists have never presented examples that meet the challenge that pose the kind of challenge captured by ENC. He considers just two examples presented by would-be constructivists. One is Cardinal Bellarmine. He argues that Bellarmine was really operating under the same principles as Galileo in adjudicating the relevant biblical evidence for astronomy. So these were evidential norms, but applied to biblical text rather than to astronomical observations. So they're really playing the same game. There's no difference here. The other is the famous Azandi case, the failure of the Azandi purportedly to respect modus ponens. And he argues that this probably reflects errors of translation in the logical operators. But they must mean something different by if, then, than we do. And there's a vast literature on whether or not there are translation errors in the treatment of the Azandi. He doesn't go into any of these details. But in either case, he takes these two examples to represent a consistent pattern of failure on the part of constructivists to find any alternative system that could meet the requirements of ENC, and concludes on this basis that no serious, coherent, action-guiding contender will diverge significantly from our own epistemic system. Therefore, he says, we have no option but to think that there are absolute practice-independent facts about what beliefs it would be most reasonable to hold under fixed evidential conditions, and that the norms embedded in contemporary science and captured by what he refers to as the classical epistemic objectivist picture of knowledge are a good approximation to these objective facts. So that's the sort of the argument of the middle part of the book. Now, my interest is not so much, as I said earlier, it's not so much in the specifics of Boghossian's rebuttal to meltdown relativism and constructivism, which I find problematic on a number of levels, specifically in the way he sets up the argument. I'm interested in what this argument obscures. It's a particularly stark example of what Alan Richardson refers to as an anxious nightmare, anxious philosophical nightmare, by which any weakening of a commitment to epistemic foundationalism is presumed to entail radical incommensurability, the threat of mutual incomprehensibility, and an inescapable corrosive relativism that leaves you with no basis for making any kind of reasoned argument about knowledge claims or a choice between methodological practices, epistemic norms. I'm in substantial agreement with Richardson and the Minnesota Pluralist. This article of Alan's appeared in the Minnesota Pluralist volume a couple years ago, that this conundrum, either you're a hardcore epistemic foundationalist or you risk being able to say nothing at all, self-contradiction, etc., that this is largely an artifact of the terms in which philosophers, we have theorized knowledge. It's clever philosophy, but it radically misrecognizes the contingency and the complexity of actual research practice. And in the process, it obscures a lot. It obscures the more prosaic forms of pluralism that are a key source of creative insight. In fact, the impetus for the dynamic evolution of research practices in quite a few traditions, and I'm focusing here on archaeology. By contrast to these fear-mongering types of critique, both philosophical and archaeological, the advocates of collaborative practice in archaeology cite innumerable ways in which their understanding of the cultural past has been enriched by engagement with non-scientific descendant communities. Consider a couple of other statements by Zimmerman that are quoted in the New York Times article, but that Boghossian doesn't cite. The rest of Larry Zimmerman's statement about science not being privileged reads as follows. That's not to say that science isn't an important way of seeing the world that has brought all kinds of benefit. But I understand that as a scientist, I need constantly to learn. He goes on to say, what's needed is a different kind of science, one developed at between the boundaries of Western ways of knowing and Indian ways of knowing. In fact, Larry Zimmerman now is doing a lot of work with homeless people, so these are lessons, these are insights that he carries into many other contexts, not only in engagement with indigenous Aboriginal communities. I contend that some of the most creative archaeological learning now taking place is in the context of resolutely pluralist collaborations, and that these exemplify the best of what Helen Mongenau describes as transformative criticism. Sources of creative insight that can significantly raise the bar epistemically, conceptually, and methodologically. I'll sketch at the end an argument I've developed elsewhere that when these projects succeed, they powerfully illustrate the virtues of extending the cognitive social norms of Longino's proceduralist account, specifically the fourth of her four social cognitive norms, that tempered equality of intellectual authority, beyond the confines of the scientific community. Along the way, my aim is to bring into focus some of the diversity of pluralisms that are a source of creative insight in these projects. By no means do they all or even often exemplify the kinds of the positions that are starkly opposed in the debates that the critics, I'll refer to them, normally, the stark opposition set up by critics who invoke science and nay-science that are the stuff of anxious philosophical and archaeological nightmares. So to begin, I want first to consider some of the kinds of challenges to which archaeologists doing collaborative research are responding. This will be familiar to many of you, so I'll move quickly through this. And then turn to some examples of the grades or types of collaborative practice that have taken shape, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. So as I say, I know this is familiar to many of you, but archaeology, to begin with these challenges, in the 70s, not only in North America and in the U.S., but especially prominently in these contexts, archaeology, a primary target of Native American activism, and indeed indigenous and aboriginal activism around the world, was the desecration of sacred sites and burials by archaeologists. So often in retrospect, people say, improbably, you had AIM activists and tribal leaders and traditionalists and Native Americans who had grown up in urban contexts and done law degrees. I mean, just a very broad cross-section Native American community who demanded rights of repatriation and reburial for individuals whose remains had languished in museums, sometimes for well over a century. They made these claims on a number of bases, and I emphasize this because they can't be reduced just to, anti-science kind of arguments. Sometimes by appeal to civil rights and freedom of religion, where treatment of the dead are concerned. More generally, on grounds of that the material that makes up the archaeological record is part of a living cultural tradition. Their cultural tradition is not part of natural history or a dead and gone cultural tradition. In this, indigenous and aboriginal peoples directly challenged the presumption that had animated archaeological and much physical anthropological research in the salvage mode for well over a century, that indigenous peoples were disappearing or had disappeared, and that the cultural history and traditions to be salvaged were significant, not to a living community, but as an element of world history, as part of, and sometimes natural history. We think of the Museum of Natural History and big anthropological collections in New York. This principle is made explicit in reactions to repatriation legislation in the 90s, when claims that ancient skeletons belong to everyone, that no living culture, I'm quoting here, no living culture, religion, interest group, biological population has the right to restrict the research mandate of scientific experts who have the necessary skills and knowledge to make the best use of surviving remnants. I'm invoking this first ancient skeletons quote of the surviving remnants as evidence. In the context of centuries-long political and legal struggle, these claims, often understood internally to be expansive and inclusive, not intended to be insulting or appropriative. But in the context of legal struggle and political struggle, these could hardly be more provocative. Consider Lori-Ann Witt's classic 1998 assessment of strategies of appropriation by which indigenous peoples had been dispossessed of their land and then their material culture, intellectual property, and her concern in that context, increasingly medical and biogenetic resources. Beginning with territorial rights, Witt argues that appropriation turns on two reinforcing legal claims. First, a declaration that the land Europeans encountered in the Americas and elsewhere was unoccupied, that it was terra nullius, to use the legal terminology, therefore in the public domain, usually accomplished by fiat of European definitions of what counts as occupation, that, for example, would not recognize traditional homelands in which people didn't have settled, nucleated villages or town sites, but actually had traditional use access to resources and were mobile. or if necessary, and in many contexts, by forcible displacement of Aboriginal peoples. Once that's accomplished, then it's a straightforward move to convert the definitionally public lands, vacant property, public land, into private, individual property. Witt makes the point that, quote, the politics of property has never been confined to land, and she considers, quoting her again, the struggle between Euro-American and indigenous cultures over the ownership of human remains. And then, as I said earlier, indigenous music and what she now is concerned with, genetic wealth and pharmaceutical knowledge. The declaration by archaeologists and physical anthropologists that indigenous skeletal remains and cultural material are a human heritage, a world heritage, and that the interests of science should determine their disposition, is immediately recognized as another instance of this two-step move to seize and then privatize indigenous property, knowledge, and cultural traditions. The second step being justified in this case by appeal to the specialized expertise and objectivity of the scientific community. Legal counter-arguments to the effect that traditional territories, material culture, music, genetic information, biomedical samples, and knowledge belong to identifiable descendant communities, cannot be treated as public domain without claimant, are, of course, the stuff of ongoing land claims and use rights struggles in a great many former settler and colonial contexts, most visibly in BC, where the entire landmass of BC, with the exception of two small pockets, are now subject to land claim, active land claims. You probably are following this as it comes up in the news, right? And the pressure to settle claims in a context where there were no treaties signed comes from mining and resource extraction interests. Right? They don't want to be investing in massive resource extraction, sort of infrastructure if they can't be sure that they'll be able to control what they take out. So I gather it's like is it Moody or a Standard & Poor's? It's like a big international financial outfit has provided a series of assessments of the risks of investing, which is what's actually driving land claims at this point. So it's a matter of active concern. In the case of archaeology, they've been the impetus in many jurisdictions for legislation that mandates repatriation. And one of the most visible kind of omnibus types of legislation is the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, which was signed into law in the U.S. in 1990. But it's by no means a unique piece of legislation. This regulatory framework and the political activism that brought it into being is one of the most visible, the most highly formalized, but it's by no means the only challenge archaeologists now face to the way they've done business in the past. So, and what I mean by that is not only are there other counterpart forms of legislation to NAGPRA in a number of jurisdictions, but also claims coming from a whole range of stakeholders, not only Indigenous Aboriginal communities. Together, these demands for accountability have fundamentally transformed the conditions under which archaeology is now practiced. Now, as earlier, it's not surprising that responses to this sea change fall along a continuum from hostile resistance through minimal compliance with requirements of consent and consultation, through a range of creative, collaborative forms of practice in which control over archaeological goals and products, conduct, and authority is redistributed among partners. These all, to varying degrees, transform disciplinary authority structures, but they have quite different epistemic and methodological implications. So to start with the kind of minimal, or sort of the low end of this continuum of practice, what's at stake minimally is a demand that archaeologists respect the interests and sensibilities of descendant communities, even if they don't credit them with epistemically compelling norms of justification or systems of belief. So archaeologists are under pressure now for some decades to actively consult with indigenous communities whose heritage they study, and increasingly to negotiate terms of access and consent for any research they undertake. So it's standard that you might now have to submit a project to tribal IRB review and develop quite complex memorandum of agreement or understanding that determine exactly what it is you can study, what you can do with the results, who owns the data, who owns the publications, and so on. It's actually not that different from human subjects reviews and constraints in other contexts. And when archaeologists are horrified by this, there are analogies in other human, regulatory frameworks for human work with human subjects that have, there are counterparts for pretty much every aspect of the MOAs and MOUs that are currently in place. So often the main outcome of these negotiations is that archaeologists, practitioners have to do archaeology in culturally sensitive ways. That can mean a proscription against destructive testing of material already recovered, or destructive excavation and testing of sacred sites, burials, or sites in general. It may require blessing and cleansing ceremonies, now a standard part of archaeological research and also presentations on tribal land. It certainly requires respect for cultural norms of access to and publicity about special objects, sites, and traditional knowledge. Increasingly also it requires archaeologists give something back, requirements of reciprocity and participation. So minimally plain language reports that bring the results of research back to an affected or descendant community of stakeholders. Also, education and outreach programs, capacity building, training, and employment of community members. So, an argument made by Eldon Yellowhorn, among others, in the Canadian context, is that it's not enough just to provide employment for a local community as labor on archaeological sites. That it has to be employment of a kind that is building skills and capacity that will be useful to that community in other ways. And increasingly what you see documented in, for example, this column in the Society for American Archaeology newsletter of the Archaeological Record, Working Together, descriptions of community-initiated projects of all kinds that have very little archaeological content and much wringing of hands. Nothing I did it, nothing I was trained in as an archaeologist prepared me to, fill in the blank, help develop an interpretive center, help develop fair trade networks, might even, help develop archaeotourism, and you can see archaeologists being anxious sometimes about the implications of that. So that those are the range of kinds of practices that are often required now as a consequence of or that are the outcome of active consultation and requirements to get consent. In principle and often in practice, even though requirements of consent, consultation, and reciprocity may constrain what archaeologists can study, they leave the archaeology itself largely unchanged. Archaeologists can pursue questions of their own internal definition in accord with disciplinary conventions that define what counts as empirical adequacy, interpretive or explanatory credibility, but subject to requirements that they explain what they're doing and why, that they get permission and follow protocols of respectful, culturally appropriate practice. Sometimes these protocols are predicated on distinctive indigenous traditions that include belief systems and oral histories of the kinds that some archaeologists have long disdained and that are at issue in the New York Times story that Bogosian was citing. A classic statement on the matter is from the anthropologist Lowy, 1915. I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to find updates of this. I cannot attach to oral traditions any historical value whatsoever. Now notice he's referring to indigenous Aboriginal cultural traditions. There's a whole world of classical archaeology that took cultural tradition quite seriously. It wasn't a question. But, this is in a context of North American anthropological inquiry, anthropological archaeology. So there's no requirement that archaeologists embrace, on this first mode of engagement, there's no requirement that archaeologists embrace the substance of these beliefs beyond respecting the fact that they matter to those with whom they work, those whose cultural traditions they study. It's rather like the injunction that you should be quiet when you enter a cathedral in Europe, that you not, party like a rock star and do obscene things in the context of a cathedral. You don't have to be a believing Christian to see that you have to respect those requirements. So the pluralism represented by this baseline mode of practice is, I suggest, a tolerant but non-interactive pluralism, a kind of syncretism, by which archaeological and indigenous modes of understanding and methodologies coexist, not always easily, but no longer with priority automatically granted to the scientific when it comes to questions of access and use. There's nothing here to alarm Bogosian, And in fact, the statements he quotes from the New York Times are not at all unusual in these contexts. Often, so you could imagine Anion or Zimmerman saying, yes, I respect the Zuni worldview. It's a perfectly sensible way to live in the world. And in the same way, you could say, I respect Christian worldview. It's a perfectly sensible way to live. I don't necessarily share it, but I will abide by, you can imagine that kind of statement. Often enough, they signal respect for epistemic difference in the absence of epistemic engagement. Very often, however, the process of consultation, especially of finding meaningful forms of reciprocity, gives rise to more robust and epistemically consequential forms of collaborative practice. Research undertaken in various forms of partnership with indigenous communities in which, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, there's the kind of interaction that does affect the substance of the science, sometimes in transformative ways. So consider first an example that mobilizes hybrid and interactive forms of expertise that begin to push the epistemic boundaries. This is Tadeda Chinchi, who you probably heard about. He's been in the news in Canadian context. He's a 550-year-old, the remains, frozen remains of a person who lived 550 years ago, discovered by sheep hunters in August 1999 on the edge of a glacier in northern BC, near the Yukon border. And he's in the traditional territory of the Champagne-Aishihik First Nations, CAFN. Now, it's worth noting, 1999, that's just a few years after Kennewick Man was discovered in Washington State, right? The object, the catalyst, the subject of a long, protracted, acrimonious legal debate. So you see lots and lots of news about Kennewick. In fact, that was part of the catalyst for the story that Yossi is citing. You see almost no sort of national news drama, about cases like this one, which took a very different direction. These First Nations, the CAFN, decided that, to quote them, efforts should be made to learn something about the person who they named long ago person found. They worked out an agreement with provincial authorities. There was already an infrastructure for working out an agreement with provincial authorities, which ensured that cultural concerns would be respected, while recognizing the significant, and again I'm quoting the CAFN statement, the significant scientific considerations inherent in a discovery of this nature. CAFN had since worked with provincial authorities and the team of researchers they assembled as full partners, reviewing and approving the research related to these human remains. The province administered the agreed-upon research, and the CAFN took the lead in ensuring that local indigenous values were respected, and also took the lead in the analysis, in the artifact analysis. The work involved carbon-14 dating, destructive dating of associated clothing and artifacts. It involved artifact analysis. His rain hat was a particular focus of interest. There's not that much in the way of woven textile or rain hat type material that's preserved. There is, of course, some in waterlogged sites on the West Coast, but this is a very sort of special artifact. A lot of interest in his ground squirrel cape. Turns out that it was made, it's a apparently big, beautiful cape, and was made with lots of different kinds of ground squirrels and related critters. Some of which came from the coast, some of which came from the interior, which turns out to be important. There was his toolkit and cache of food, and I believe that lower tool is one that's described in the CAFN newsletters on this as a hand tool of unknown use. We've got the whole thing, including sinew, stuff that normally doesn't survive in archaeological context, and nobody really knows what it was for. There are lots of other kinds of tools that were of more obvious, the function was more obvious, more recognizable. There is also a full pathology workup and a food residue analysis, a complete autopsy. If you remember the story about Otzi, the frozen guy up in the mountains at the border between Austria and Italy, that he's like, 5,300 years old, so he's a lot older than Kware Damchinchi, but in his case, I don't know if it's because of the nature of the preservation, they just did needle testing to get at what was in his digestive tract. With Tade Damchinchi, they did a full autopsy, so they were able to reconstruct in about 3-hour increments everything he'd eaten over the previous 3 days before he died, top to bottom, the whole thing. And there are just fascinating details, especially like mineral residue from different water sources, different kinds of seeds that don't digest so well, and so on. So anyway, tons of fascinating interesting outcome and what he ingested in those 3 days. They also did lifetime dietary profile based on isotope and trace element analysis of dentition and bone core, which shows that he primarily, his lifetime dietary profile is largely marine. So he mainly lived on the coast and eaten marine source foods. Lots of analysis of pollens, microbes, parasites, insects lodged in the traveler's fabulous squirrel cape, hair, skin, which provide environmental clues to the specifics of this last trip that he took. It looks like he probably was either sort of very quickly frozen in a sudden storm or fell down a crevasse. Can't really tell, but anyway, that's the end he came to. But most interesting, the CAFN commissioned a community DNA analysis. And if you know anything about the state of play in doing DNA analysis with indigenous and aboriginal communities, you'll recognize that that's pretty special. I mean, basically shut down, not something you can ask for. They wanted a community DNA study. I think they sampled like 200 people because they wanted to determine which family and clan group should handle the burial, the memorial and burial for Kwade Danchinchi. It was important to know if there were any living relatives. So what's been learned? He was 18 to 20 years old, had traveled roughly 100 kilometers in the 3 days before his death, likely in the summer, given the insects and other things, pollens and stuff. As I said, his lifetime dietary profile indicates that he lived on the coast, ate a marine diet. The food and water residue from his most recent meals make it clear that his trip originated at the coast, and you can specify quite closely which route he followed into the mountains. His clothing and toolkit incorporates both coastal and interior elements, as I indicated. The community DNA study has identified 17 matrilineal descendants, which means then you expand out from the matrilineal descendants from 2 clans. I think it's Wolf and I'm forgetting the other clan. But anyway, 2 closely connected clans, both interior and coastal, which is, again, a pretty significant kind of finding. Significant to the CAFN because that then informs who should take care of his last rites. But what I haven't seen published anywhere, I hear a lot about it, is that this sort of interior and coastal combination in the artifacts and DNA based affiliations call into question ethnographic and archaeological reliance on reified ethnic categories that give primacy to geographically localized tribal affiliations rather than family clan affiliations. So the Aishik and Champagne, I gather, understand perfectly clearly that primary affiliations are with family, and that cross-cuts tribal territories. But, the stuff of land claims of 100 years or more of sort of ethnographic and legal articulation of who claimants are has really reified tribal affiliations as the dominant one. So this represents a significant challenge, a significant insight of ethnographic and archaeological input. Kwade Danchinchi's remains were cremated and scattered where he was discovered after these samples had been taken and analyzed. There's a book summarizing the results of the research and also the collaborative process, which I believe is in press. It should be out soon. So this is a case where formal infrastructure for collaborative work made significant scientific work possible, including work that addressed questions of interest to the First Nations that weren't, in fact, on the agenda for archaeologists, or medical anthropologists, or glaciologists, or paleoethnobotanists, among others, who made up the scientific research team. Even though the types of inquiry required to address these questions do fall squarely within the ambit of conventional archaeological science. It's also a case, it's also a case which illustrates the fact that Indigenous partners have long had to cultivate an understanding of and to navigate the norms of Euro-American knowledge production, authorization, and aligned legal traditions. They are, of necessity, skilled cultural translators who have considerable meta-expertise and sometimes interactional expertise in and about fields in which they are not themselves contributory experts. And I'm using here the terminology put into circulation by Collins and Evans. I don't necessarily want to invoke the whole of the baggage of Collins and Evans' book Rethinking Expertise, but these are, I think, quite useful distinctions and concepts. So, in this puts, because indigenous communities have to be savvy, translators and, in a sense, consumers of scientific research types of expertise, it puts community partners in a position to make sophisticated appraisals of the contributory expertise of the scientists with whom they collaborate, to judge what various scientific specialisms might bring to the project, what they can ask of their collaborators, at the same time as they bring their own contributory expertise to bear as cultural advisors, museum, and cultural heritage professionals. More challenging and more rewarding epistemically are collaborative partnerships that grade into what I'm calling a dynamic pluralism or an interactive pluralism of the kind that defenders of objectivity and disciplinary autonomy love to hate. These include a range of projects that have taken shape in recent decades. There are antecedents, but especially in the last 25 years, in which community members are directly involved in the intellectual work of archaeology, working with archaeologists to set the research agenda, shaping both the process and the products of archaeological inquiry. The goal here, as described by George Nicholas, who is at Simon Fraser and runs intellectual property issues and cultural heritage, a big SHRP network grant project. The goal is not only to make archaeology accountable, as he puts it, to redress real and perceived inequalities in the practice of archaeology, but also, and crucially, and I'm quoting George Nicholas again, to inform and broaden the understanding and interpretation of the archaeological record through the incorporation of Aboriginal worldviews, histories, and science. It is, of course, the very idea that archaeological inquiry might be in any way influenced by or held accountable to Indigenous Aboriginal understanding of their own history and cultural traditions that really raises hackles. And yet, as I've indicated, a growing number of advocates of collaborative practice are making the case that far from compromising the integrity of their archaeology, these collaborations have greatly enhanced their practice, their science, as science. So consider an argument for this kind of engagement in which what's at stake is precisely the question of what can or should count as evidence, a pretty fundamental feature of engagement, a pretty fundamental norm of justification in the scientific context. What can or should count as evidence for credible claims about the cultural past. And I'm relying here on this is an argument that's due to Roger Echohawk, a Native American historian archaeologist, I believe still at the museum in Denver, Museum of Natural History in Denver. Some of the starkest confrontations between science and indigenous knowledge are over the standing of oral history, oral tradition, as I mentioned earlier and as Bogosian's opening example illustrates. Echohawk cites a number of reasons for this, and you get them here. On the one hand, tribal elders who are most knowledgeable about oral tradition are often religious leaders who emphasize the spiritual aspects of these traditions and the holism of these traditions. They should be read as one holistic truth. And those who are committed to these traditions feel that analysis of their historical content is inappropriate. Just another example of imposition and exploitation, or at best irrelevant. On the other side, there's the long tradition that I mentioned earlier of archaeologists and other scholars dismissing oral tradition as unstable, malleable, fictions at best, projections of faith-based religious commitment that, as a genre, cannot be considered relevant to archaeological science, to empirical inquiry, can't be credited as bearing any literal descriptive information about the cultural past. By contrast, in a series of articles in the late 90s, Roger Echohawk argues that indigenous oral tradition should be understood to be complex and multidimensional. So he's pushing back against the holism insisted upon by tribal elders and religious leaders in his own community. They do certainly incorporate spiritual, metaphorical components of legends about spirits, about supernatural creatures and events. They also, he argues, carry accurate information about community histories, migrations, lifeways, and also geological and climatic events, sometimes of remarkable time depth, going back as far as the late Pleistocene. At the end of David Hurst Thomas's book, Skull Wars, there are a couple of chapters there where he describes a whole series of legends. One especially striking one is the Klamath in the area of Crater Lake in California. A sort of very supernatural, a story about supernatural beings hurling fire and lightning, and then a very detailed description of the collapse of the mountain. And apparently, as a geological event, what the volcanic explosion and collapses that made Crater Lake is very distinctive. That the caldera collapsed inward, and the details evidently are, quite specific. And that's going back, I think it's like 12,000 years, 9,500. I mean, late Pleistocene, a long way back. What Echo Hawk is particularly interested in is an analysis of Caddoan oral tradition in the Central Plains, mainly in the U.S., in which he finds recurrent convergent accounts of Pawnee movements and cultural traditions. Immigration west and east, linked to the advent of circular and then square forms of earth lodge architecture, and the emergence of animal ceremonialism that are identifiable in the archaeological record, that establish the affiliation of contact period Pawnee with what archaeologists have identified as Central Plains cultural traditions dating to AD 950 to 1400. The significance of this is that on conventional archaeological historical wisdom, the Pawnee could not have entered the Central Plains until the Spanish drove them out of the southwest, sometime around AD 1600. So this evidence from oral traditions, in conjunction with archaeological sources, establishes Caddoan presence in the Central Plains for at least the past 1,000 years. So it's a pretty striking reassessment of how archaeological material had been interpreted, drawing on this distinctive oral history-derived line of evidence. A key element in Echo Hawk's analysis is his argument for reinterpreting what had been understood as references to actual animal spirits as instead descriptions of animal ceremonialism, of ceremonial experts performing particular type of animal roles, as it were, indicative of cultural contact and the influence of neighboring Skidi people. So you have ceremonial experts moving between cultural traditions and bringing with them, the animal spirit. I forget which the animal spirits were, but the person who performs that particular animal spirit bringing wisdom and knowledge about, architectural form that is then instantiated in the archaeological record, or was instantiated back in the day and survives in the record. Underpinning Roger Echo Hawk's argument for taking oral history seriously, for considering entrenched norms of justification in archaeology and history, reconsidering these norms that privilege written or material record, is an appreciation of the discipline that's required, that's involved in learning and maintaining oral traditions. Among the Dakota, for example, I'm referring here to Angela Cavender Wilson, it's assumed that, quote, the ability to remember is an acquired skill, one that may be acutely developed or neglected. Wilson describes the discipline instilled in early training and lifelong practice in telling and retelling key life and community histories. In private, small children practicing these stories after dinner every night, in public and more. Lots of context for correction, think Wittgenstein. Right? So these are sustained in a very disciplined way by the whole community. So if learning and maintaining an oral tradition is a form of expertise, a rigorous community practice, it should not be surprising, where it survives, that it could be a rich repository of evidence about past events and conditions of life. Echo Hawk's purpose here is to reframe polarized debate, in which oral sources are written off by archaeologists, frustrated with, as he in this top quote, by yet another collision between science and religion. and Indians who reject insights from, as he puts it, his language, Indians, Native Americans, who reject insights from the archaeological record as irrelevant to understanding Pawnee history. Each source enriches and refines and redefines the other on his account in his own practice. So that's Echo Hawk's purpose. To return to my purpose, the kind of practice Echo Hawk advocates and exemplifies illustrates what is to be gained by engaging what Larry Zimmerman described as this new kind of science, where the contributory expertise brought to bear on conventional archaeological problems is itself hybrid. It's a form of dynamic or interactive pluralism. Now, no doubt a critic like Bogosian, would assimilate this example to his treatment of the Bellarmine and Azandi cases. One part translation error, one part vindication of Western science, in which scientific norms ultimately prevail. It's just a case of savvy appropriation of scientifically useful resources from non-scientific cultures. A late example of well-documented practices by which colonial and imperial interests have extracted and rendered respectively scientific the traditional knowledge of any number of colonial subjects and subdominant others. But this is to miss the point. In fact, it's to miss a number of key points. First, the translation process is much more complex, much more interactive, much more dynamic than a simple, they sometimes got it right, despite themselves. Okay? It requires attention to context of use, to context of use and different registers in which claims are made within an oral tradition, in this case, community history. It's a matter of developing robust interactive expertise on the part of archaeologists, of an archaeologist, with respect to oral tradition. It introduces a set of methodological norms and norms of justification to archaeology that had not gotten traction in archaeological context. Second, to frame the debate more generally, to frame the debate in terms of epistemic absolutes is to miss the dynamic negotiations that I've just described, required to hammer out at the level of practice specific epistemic aims and the norms of evidential reasoning, of what will count as evidence, how to make use of this kind of evidence relevant to these aims. So to pull together the threads of this discussion, consider three final questions. There they are. What actually do these collaborative practices contribute to archaeology? What kinds of pluralism do they represent? And what is the epistemic rationale for them? Why should one think that they have, as it were, epistemic payoff of the creative kinds I'm referring to? Well, first of all, what's gained? The Tade Danshinchi case illustrates how consultative engagement, on the face of it non-interactive in the sense of not transformative epistemically, kind of epistemic syncretism, can result in a productive recasting of focal questions. The research agenda is changed, enlarged. Roger Echo Hawk's work shows how a more dynamic cross-tradition engagement can destabilize long-standing conventions about evidence and illustrates the impact that new lines of evidence and interpretive resources can have on long-standing lines of inquiry. Crucially, both examples illustrate how fruitful it can be to bring a critical outsider or insider-outsider, in the case of Roger Echo Hawk, perspective to bear on disciplinary conventions. The enforced engagement with descendant communities has, in some cases, put archaeologists in a position to recognize just how purpose-specific, how contingent, in some respects, how limited and tradition-bound are the entrenched methodological and epistemic norms of justification that define currently what it is to do archaeological science. In short, archaeologists are finding that if their point of departure isn't an intellectual version of terra nullius, they have potential partners who can significantly enrich not just their store of facts or expand their repertoire of working hypotheses, but keep them epistemically honest and keep sort of the epistemic methodological dimension of the research program, keep it dynamic, keep it developing, keep a critical edge. Where the second question is concerned, I've identified a spectrum of pluralisms manifest in research practice ranging from respectful coexistence to much more dynamic generative forms of CBPR or CBCHR, so community-based cultural historical research, culture historical research. Some observations about them, about these. Even sort of respectful but arm's length coexistence with no significant cross-fertilization of substantive beliefs and epistemic traditions requires some degree of systematically cultivated mutual understanding. It requires that archaeologists and non-archaeologists develop a capacity for discerning adjudication of expertise, meta-expertise at least, and sometimes a measure of interactive expertise with respect to each other's knowledge traditions. It sustains what I've been calling a kind of syncretic pluralism. And of course, Boghossian's epistemic objectivism is safe from challenge, but it's one that is it just is not on the table for discussion when the debate's set up the way he sets it up, and that is very generative, very productive in archaeological contexts. Collaborative practice, in its various grades, requires, in addition, that archaeologists recognize indigenous peoples, their community partners, as bringing, in fact, contributory expertise to their joint projects. And as is the case of more conventional forms of interdisciplinarity, these extradisciplinary engagements will only succeed if the partners, drawn from different expert communities, develop sufficient interactive expertise with respect to the specialism in which their partners have contributory expertise. Only in that case will they be able to engage effectively. And this gives rise to what I've been referring to as a dynamic or interactive pluralism of at least two kinds. One is a limited kind of cross-fertilization, a matter of assimilating to an archaeological framework some detachable, factual, or interpretive knowledge generated within an autonomous epistemic tradition, or the more transformative interactions that I've been referring to, in which archaeological partners learn to see their own research traditions from the standpoint of other ways of understanding, of living in the world, a comparative, reflexive move that throws into relief the limitations and the strengths, the problem and convention specificity of their own contributory expertise. So, finally, philosophical implications. What are the epistemic implications? What's the epistemic rationale for these stronger grades of collaborative practice, given that they've been seen as so threatening epistemically? Most prosaically, the central principle at work here is articulated by Larry Zimmerman when he observes that as a scientist, he has to be prepared constantly to learn. And I take it what he means here is not just in the sense of learning new things, new facts, new interpretive resources, but of learning new ways of learning about the science, taking critical stance on and learning new possibilities, new ways of pushing, refining, redirecting the science he practices. Within philosophical context, this point is captured by the Liberal Democratic Convention that more ideas, more diverse voices and angles of vision are inherently a good thing, epistemically. The wider the range of perspectives you bring to bear on a question in assessment of prospective knowledge claims, the more likely it is that error and bias will be exposed, that the full complexity of the subject will be engaged, and that you'll develop better arguments for the positions you advance. If this sounds like channeling John Stuart Mill, that's exactly what it is. These are epistemic formulation of his arguments. So consider Helen Longino's articulation of this principle in terms of a procedural account of objectivity, that the beliefs we should count as knowledge are those that arise from the right kind of process of critical scrutiny. The right kind of process is one which ensures that contending beliefs are subject to criticism from multiple points of view. So this is a quote from her most recent book, Fate of Knowledge. So this right process is one, in effect, that secures the possibility of transformative criticism. Transformative criticism is a term she introduced in her early work in the early 90s. Doesn't figure in this later book, but I think is relevant here. So here are the four, the conditions that Longino characterizes for transformative criticism, for a well-functioning research community, are these four socio-cognitive, social cognitive norms, which she argues should govern the processes of deliberation within scientific communities. What's relevant here is the fourth of these, tempered equality of epistemic authority. A well-functioning scientific community must ensure that hypotheses are exposed to the broadest possible range of criticism. And it's not just a matter of social injustice, but a cognitive failing. If a research community fails to take seriously the criticisms of dissenting voices, or the input of dissenting voices. It's not just that they should be tolerated, they should be actively cultivated. The limitation of this account, as presented in The Fate of Knowledge, is that Longino's framing these as ideals of inclusion and attention that apply internally to a community of scientists. There's no provision for seeking out external communities that might hold relevant expertise or extending to them this norm of tempered equality of epistemic authority so that they might actually play a role directly in the practice of critically assessing the credibility of knowledge claims and the epistemic norms that underwrite them. Now, of course, the risk here is that communities of epistemic peers who share common cognitive goals and conventions of practice may also share considerable cognitive lacunae about their subject domain and their own dominant traditions of inquiry, their dominant methodological epistemic norms. To motivate a discerning extension of Longino's norms of critical engagement to external communities, I've elsewhere made the case that we need the resources of a sophisticated standpoint theory. So I'm not going to give a full dress account of this, but the key elements are these, the argument I'm making for reconceptualizing standpoint theory in non-essentialist terms and dissociating it from a claim of automatic epistemic privilege. The first key claim is the situated knowledge thesis, a recognition that what we experience and know is a function not just of our unique personal histories and talents, but of lines of social differentiation on a structural differentiation on a large scale, on a social scale. The impact of social differentiation, if it doesn't necessarily have epistemic impact, but where it has epistemic impact, is both in determining who will count as a credible knower, and I'm drawing in the second section on Miranda Fricker's account of epistemic injustice, testimonial forms of injustice, who will count as, what working indicators do we rely on to identify those we will take seriously as epistemically credible, as experts. And she describes a whole range of examples of credibility overspill in the case of those who have sort of high-status social markers, but don't actually know much about the field they're pronouncing on, or of epistemic injustice in the case of, say, a minority, a doctor or a professor, by gender, by race, by any number of measures, who actually has the expertise, but isn't recognized to have it because of the operation of social norms. The second component is what she describes as hermeneutical, in connection with hermeneutical injustice, that there may be developing within a community that's marginalized a whole range of epistemic resources, conceptual cognitive resources, for characterizing dimensions of the world, social and natural world, that are not recognized typically on dominant epistemic norms as credible, or for which there are not resources to communicate and characterize. So what follows from that is a third point, that there may in fact be epistemic advantage, not privilege, but epistemic advantage on the margins. That those who are socially marginalized and often discounted as knowers may actually be a source of, may hold crucial kinds of epistemic resources. And there are, these kinds of epistemic insights and resources that arise on the margins can take a number of different forms. Most prosaically, those who are socially marginal may be privy to evidence, may develop interpretive heuristics necessary to understand and to navigate dimensions of the social natural world that the comparatively privileged rarely engage or are actively invested in not having to deal with. So you get the whole range of examples in the standpoint theory literature of African American domestic who knows tons of stuff about the wealthy, the wealthy white elites they work for, that even members of the wealthy white elite community don't know because they take out the garbage and then change the bedroom and so on. So that's quite a prosaic kind of epistemic advantage. You just are in the way. You hear things, you see things, you have access to evidence that those in privileged, socially privileged positions may not or are studiously avoid. More controversially, distinctive, unrecognized or unrecognizable forms of knowledge may arise from non-mainstream ways of living in the world. Tacit knowledge, sensibilities that have taken shape quite independently of the traditions that constitute a dominant culture. And that's the kind of claim that in some cases, Aboriginal communities, indigenous communities are in a position to make, that they draw on oral tradition and other kinds of traditions of practice that have deep roots and are autonomous of mainstream modes of understanding and living in the world. Finally, the experience of exclusion and marginalization may itself be a source of insight. Think here of W.E.B. Du Bois on double vision, of Dorothy Smith on the kinds of sociological ruptures, especially by which especially insider or outsiders are in a position to see norms and see the limitations of them, bring critical perspective to bear, that those who comfortably fit a dominant culture, a dominant set of epistemic norms are not aware of, or they just take them for granted. Sometimes combinations of these kinds of advantage, certainly this last kind of advantage, can give rise to a critical standpoint on knowledge production. And I emphasize that standpoint here is an accomplishment. It's not just, occupying perceptually or experientially a distinctive social position. It's a critical, reflective appreciation of knowledge production, of the limitations of the norms of dominant forms of knowledge production. Taken together, I argue that these considerations constitute grounds for a presumptive principle of epistemic advantage on the margins. Those who are socially marginal may be epistemically advantaged in ways that are relevant to specific epistemic projects, and that conventional working indicators just don't track, and the conventional epistemic and conceptual resources don't give you, that you don't have the resources to articulate. So the standpoint theory derived principle that I propose, one that I believe makes sense of the kinds of epistemic advantage associated with pluralist collaborative practice in archaeology is the following, that well-functioning epistemic communities, in order to counteract the kinds of insularity now well known from HPS and STS contexts, must seek out critical collaborative engagement with those communities that are most likely to have the resources, not only to fill lacunae and correct specific errors in substantive beliefs, but also to generate a critical standpoint on their own knowledge-making and ratifying practices. The rationale for duties of attention and response, to use Longino's language, attention and response to collaborative partners, thus arises not only from moral and political and sometimes legal obligations to descendant and affected communities, but also an epistemic obligation rooted in the norms of critical engagement that are constitutive of scientific practice, scientific inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. We now have time for questions, and I should remark that we'll also be able to entertain questions from colleagues who are viewing the talk through our live podcast. So at the appropriate time, we'll entertain those questions. But you who are in the room get the first shot. Who's in charge of lights in the room? Here. There you go. Yes, Amy. There's a microphone.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I noticed that much of the points you made seem to be internal to the practice of archaeology. And I was wondering, it seems to me that there might be another way to motivate some of what you were saying that strikes me also as very important for the practice of archaeology. And so what I have in mind is a story I read recently in Florida. The governor in the funding institutions are looking to defund archaeological programs. But by engaging in these collaborative, pluralistic practices, it also seems like we're giving a larger community outside of academia a stake at what's going on, and creating a larger voice to defend this branch of science. And that seems incredibly important and relevant, not just for the epistemic community within archaeology, but for everyone. And it increases the size of the community who have a stake in this project. So I was wondering if you had any.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. I mean, there are all kinds of moral, political, instrumental, being a good citizen, all kinds of reasons to do collaborative practice. And those are the primary ones that motivate this tradition of research. I think it's fair to say. So I don't in any sense mean to marginalize those or discount them. But part of the genesis of this project, and I know some of you have heard earlier versions of it, it was meant to be an intervention initially into an archaeological debate, where those doing collaborative practice were facing these, really intransigent critics and criticisms, basically saying, well, then you're not doing science anymore. And so, you're allowing the political and the instrumental and the conservationist and outreach kinds of interests to displace what really should be your core business, doing good archaeology. And what really strikes me is that completely misses the discussion, which is central, what you see a lot in the literature on and discussions of collaborative practice, are archaeologists saying, yeah, it's hard work, it's a different kind of work, there are all kinds of reasons I do it, but I didn't anticipate till I got into it just how much better it would make my archaeology as archaeology. And not just doing the same old archaeology, but doing archaeology where the research agenda is shifted in various ways, different lines of evidence are considered, different norms for weighing that evidence. There's tremendous compelling literature on the whole range of reasons you're describing. What I want to articulate more systematically is why these kinds of practices are also good epistemically. And the parallels are really striking. Earlier sort of ancestor talks to this one. I started off by looking at the arguments that have been developed over decades and decades in participatory action research and sociology, community forestry, public health genetics, all kinds of contexts where you'll find, not only doing social science kinds of practice, but people doing agronomy, experimental, dealing with experimentally trying to, breed. My favorite example is breed bean varieties that are resistant to root rot in Rwanda, who say their science, their experimental practice was improved by collaborating from the get-go rather than isolating themselves in an experimental station and doing their plant genetics and then taking the best of what they found out to the community. So I initially drew inspiration from a range of other fields in which collaborative practice is being advocated. Sometimes by people who say, I was dragged kicking and screaming into this. I thought it was like the end of me doing real science. And I would never do it any other way now. And I wanted to try to develop the parallel arguments here. But not to displace the kinds of concerns you raised.
Bill Harper.
I was really impressed with getting the DNA testing.
Isn't that fascinating? Yeah.
The 500-year-old.
550. Yeah.
550.
That's a lot of generations.
Yeah. And impressed about the way that it led to information about, how to put it, information about both inland combined relationship to both inland and to coastal in a way that just opened up a whole new kind of insight. And you were indicating that people in the know, you suggested,
Yeah,
would
retail
would be
gossip.
just astounded that people were willing to do the DNA testing. And how much of a factor it was. I mean, this seems like a very clear example of what you're, really quite powerful example of opening up information that wouldn't have been available unless you had this collaborative approach. Is that?
Well, and indeed, and connects to the previous question, that because there's already an infrastructure and collaborative practice was already engaged, there was an extended community willing to do, interested in doing this for their own purposes. Right? Think Human Genome Project. Indigenous protests around the world basically shut that down. And here's an example, and especially, Northwest Coast, Canadian context, I'm sure others know the details of this better than I do, but famous case in which blood samples were gathered by a researcher, medical researcher. I think ostensibly, originally, he was going to do work with a Northwest Coast community, I think on Vancouver Island, as I remember, on maybe rheumatism. High rates of rheumatism seem to be, heritable rheumatism in this community. Gathered all these blood samples and shoved off to England, did an analysis of DNA, did a DNA analysis and was publishing stuff on, who knows about this case? I know when I'm on the Northwest Coast I can call on people in the audience to say exactly chapter and verse. But anyway, published studies of the blood samples, of the DNA of the blood samples that had never been approved. And apparently did not bring back very much in the way of medically useful information to the community, to deal with the primary problem. And then when tribal members discovered this some years later, and I've heard various stories about how this happened, outraged. And I gather that a whole lot of the genome bank legislation, Canadian context, infrastructure for determining what use is legitimate of samples of that kind comes out of that sort of case. So it's really fraught in exactly the area with exactly the kinds of First Nations who called for a DNA study. But the intellectual payoff that's so striking is, and again, I wait with bated breath to see the book because I've only heard this in conference discussion and so on, is that it really destabilizes standard ethnographic categories in terms of which Asia, Champagne, and other First Nations have been understood in terms of the legend, the land claims kind of legal framework in which claims are negotiated. As it was described to me by one of the people working with them, Asia Champagne understood that there were all kinds of coastal and interior connections. That was no mystery. Here's really tangible evidence of just how deep and connected those are. When I first gave a version of this talk, I just mentioned, this was some years ago, mentioned this case. It was just beginning to get, there were just beginning to be some publications about it. And a geneticist in the audience, an anthropological geneticist, said, well, I really, the results weren't in yet. So it was just the fact that the community was willing to do this that was striking. He said, well, I can't believe there's going to be really anything come out of this because there's so many generations, that's so many generations. And you just think of the dispersal of people and it's not, it would be an accident if they found anything. Well, 17 matrilineal relatives. And then you take those matrilineal relatives, because they're going through mtDNA, and you extend all of their relations. That, again, I take it the tribal groups knew perfectly well that there hadn't been a lot of dispersal and whatever. So it's a compelling account. And what strikes me is that there's not any big dramatic, clash of worldviews, and yet you get some really significant rethinking of these norms of practice.
Other questions? Can I go way out of silly, but how, if at all, does this relate to the big discussions in anthropology about the status of the discipline as a science or not science? Is there a way of connecting? I was asking how, if at all, Alison thinks the topics she's discussed today relate to the debates inside anthropology about its status as a science or not a science.
Yeah. Well, so anthropologists in the room, I take it that's not your little table. You might prefer to answer this on my behalf. I haven't thought in those terms. Anthropology, of course, 4 subfields, sometimes a house divided. But the interesting thing is that think of the Stanford department when it split. Now it's been put back together. Letterhead reduction, programming, they've been put back together. But when they split, it wasn't archaeology, physical anthropology versus cultural and linguistics, right? It was the culturalist, I forget even what the titles were, wing, and the more anthropological science wing. And one of the first things that the culturalist wing did was go out and hire an archaeologist in the form of Ian Hodder, right? Who, is famous for pushing post-processual approaches, more interpretivist, more humanistic approaches. So archaeology itself incorporates more humanistic and more scientific approaches. So I guess the first point I want to make is that it's hard to say anything across the board about what kind of a science anthropology is as a whole. It's even within the subfields, it's a very complex collection of research traditions and research interests. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing if people can actually, some of these models of collaborative practice, the kinds of interactive expertise, the kinds of contributory, bringing different kinds of contributory expertise together, very hard to do, sometimes even harder to do within a self-identified academic discipline than between representatives of that discipline and non-disciplinary partners. But I think there's sort of reflexive lessons here. What's striking on the ground, you may all just hate this, but it strikes me that some of the most interesting post-processual work that's happening now, it's really science-heavy. Post-processual, the more humanistic, interpretivist approach. So a colleague of mine at Washington, University of Washington, University of Washington, Seattle, is a very technical GIS expert. But he's using these technical, spatial analysis, quantitative geography kind of tools to get at cultural landscape. So he's putting that technical work, those technical skills to work to do interpretivist kinds of approaches. So I'm inclined, I think it's an unfortunate debate, is I guess what I would want to say. I take anthropology to be a kind of conjury of different research traditions, all of which are engaged in different kinds of empirical inquiry. And even the most text-based and interpretivist humanistic traditions, I take it, are engaged in systematic empirical inquiry. It's just a very different kind of practice than, say DNA testing or wet lab, analysis of dietary status and things like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes?
I'm not sure if this question is on track or not. You can help me see if it is or not. But one thing one often hears is that you can only really have a deep understanding of a phenomenon if it's really simple. You sometimes hear that, and that's why one needs idealization in science. You don't really have science without idealization. So you don't have a deep understanding unless you screen things out, either because they're irrelevant or because it would just be too much information, overwhelming. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I'm just wondering, is there some tension between the need for idealization and the sort of thing that you're talking about? It seems to involve bringing in so much more detail and information. And you even mentioned complexity at one point, like we need to do justice to the complexity of the subject or the phenomenon or something like that. On the face of it, which is an important qualification, I think, but on the face of it, it seems so different from what one often hears about simplifying, leaving things out, ignoring irrelevant information.
Yeah, well, again, actually, Kathleen's question is a great great setup for this, because, or leads into this, because there are a lot of different questions one can ask using, that archaeologists could conceivably be addressing. And there's a very strong tradition certainly at the University of Washington, of work on behavioral ecology. Sort of large-scale, long-term population dynamics within specific physical environments. And the modeling is complex in some technical senses, and they build in lots of different kinds of variables. But there's a research tradition in which I think idealization is crucial. Just the kind you're describing. So there's a set of questions that require certain kinds of data to be collected, certain kinds of modeling techniques that are, in a way, simplifying. To see the large-scale dynamics of community movement or response to environmental pressure of various kinds. The new archaeology, the processual archaeology of the 70s, 80s, really, certainly not all new archaeologists are processualists, but certainly that was, in a sense, the ideal of the kind of work that the new archaeology was going, was advocating. If you want to do real science, that's the kind of product. Of course, they dolled it up in Hempelian covering law terms, but actually I think the kind of modeling practices you're describing that are manifest in all kinds of sophisticated life sciences, physical sciences, would have captured better that impulse. The rebuttal to it was, but I'm not doing justice to the post-processual critique, the more humanistic interpretivist critique. The argument was, well, first of all, there are a whole lot of other questions that we might be able to and want to answer that would require that more humanistic understanding, a more interpretivist understanding, might require attention to particular contexts, lifeways, forms of practice, traditions. And you want a lot of rich detail. Idealization of a sort is going to be valuable, but Pompeii, everybody loves to hate, but it's a fabulous site. But Pompeii gives you an opportunity to get at particular detail in people's lives. Right? Are you going to refuse to engage it because it doesn't give you the kind of data that will allow you to do an idealizing model? No, and it seems so. There has tended to be very sharp. I'm sure you're immersed in this. That sharp opposition between a self-identified sort of scientizing impulse, which might go in, among other directions, the direction you're describing, and a more humanistic impulse, which goes more in the direction of emphasizing narrative and much more particularistic kinds of understanding. I think it's a shame that they are characterized, that anybody would claim that either should be the dominant and sole objective of the discipline, or that epistemic credibility lives in one place or the other. I mean, both can be done badly or done well. And they have their own internal kinds of norms of justification that are evolving. So what I have in the back of my mind is an argument that Hassik Chang, I think, will be in I think it was like 5th or 6th chapter of this new book he's publishing on H2O. And it's an argument for a certain kind of pluralism. And he's, of course, thinking about chemistry and physics and astronomy, physical sciences for the most part. He argues that, in limited beings that we are, we should recognize that, we should not insist that it's always a good strategy to put all our eggs in the basket of whatever research program within a science looks to be getting, moving most quickly and getting the most traction. We know, a version of a pessimistic induction is that whatever looks to be most fast-moving and productive right now may well, might peter out, or there are other courses of inquiry that will later prove to be productive. So, as we ought to cultivate multiple different, a plurality of goals and modes of practice. And I would say, in the case of archaeology, at least a range spanning the two poles that I've described is appropriate. Sometimes they'll cross-fertilize, sometimes they just motor along on their own. Does that? Yeah. So I don't think there's one. The idea that unification and simplicity is an end in itself, I think, is a trap and a delusion. It's useful and important for certain kinds of research goals, certain kinds of research practice. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other questions we could be asking or programs of research we ought to be supporting. Huh?
Well, it's past 5 o'clock now, so are there further questions? Oh, yes. Okay, by all means.
Thank you. Thanks. I was wondering if you could bring back some of the discussion that you started out with regarding Boghossian, because well, it's been a while since I've read that, but it seems to me like his his use of some discussion of mythology from a particular culture wasn't so much to try to exclude the kind of collaborative research program that you described. It seems like he's trying to just use a particular example of a mythology that gives you a kind of epistemic system that would come into conflict with the scientific epistemic system. And I believe he was using this to try to show how scientific epistemology has some advantages that you don't get with some sort of mythology. So do you think that his sort of thesis could incorporate the kind of multidisciplinary research program that you describe? Or is his account really too rigid to include a lot of the stuff that you like?
Well, I really welcome this question, and I got pressed hard on these kinds of questions when I gave this talk at the Kinney Grad Center this past week. It was quite interesting. So what exactly is the difference between you and Boghossian? The main difference is, I would say, I want to reframe the question. His goal is to show that no form of constructivism about facts, about norms of justification, or about how we explain the beliefs we hold is viable. And that we therefore should embrace an epistemic foundationalism. And maybe he'd be sympathetic. I mean, I think the way he would read everything I'm describing is, the norms of science are prevailing. Here's a going research tradition, scientific research tradition that is appropriating useful bits and should do more of that. And I'm not sure how he would respond, because as I say, he didn't at all engage these archaeology examples except just to set up the opposition. And what strikes me is that when you frame the question about norms of justification in those terms, you miss all the interesting dynamism by which these norms are evolving. Right? When he refers to the scientific method, and the classic picture of knowledge, I frankly don't know what he's referring to. Are we referring to, Baconian ideas about, winkling insights out of nature that she didn't intend to tell us? Are we talking about contemporary, superconducting super collider, factory scale physics? Are we talking, if the norms are so abstract, if the